I will say that it's not the biggest snowstorm that I've kind of lived through here in the 70s, early 70s, either 73 or 74, I can't remember. We had little over 24 inches of snow up at the vineyard and winery. And it took 3 days, 3 full days, before Napa County plowed the road to where anybody could get up and down the mountain. Now, that having been said, this particular storm that started on Thursday night was clearly the most destructive. Whether it was, well, first of all, the snow, we had just under a foot of snow up on top of the mountain, so half of what we had in 73, but it was a really wet snow, just intensely wet. And driving, we tried to get up, Charlie, Julianne, and I tried to get up the mountain on Friday morning, and we got as high as Langtree Road and couldn't get any further. We did get back up that evening, and there were a number of cars that were stranded on the road. What was most interesting is the number of large oak branches that had come down across the road. There were several dozens, if not more, of both trees, having oak trees falling over. There's one spot in above Langtree where the root ball was 8 feet in diameter, and I'm looking down, straight down into the hole, and it's got to be a good 7-8 feet deep, and it took out about 4 feet of the pavement. But there were just limbs everywhere, and then when we got to our winery, we saw the olive trees, and I have never seen our olive trees decimated by snow or anything like this storm did. We just had, every tree had branches just ripped off of them. And it's quite a mess. Now, somebody asked me the other day, is the snow good or bad for the vineyards? Well, it's not bad at all. The snow will eventually melt, and the melt will go into the ground, and the ground needs all the water we can give it. Even though we're approaching normal for this year, we're dealing with a 4 or 5 year deficit of drought. So we need every drop we can get. The other one is cold has a tendency to kill off a lot of bugs. And we vineyardists don't like bugs. We kind of like to have a bug-free, especially the bad bugs, bug-free environment. And it's entertaining, it's challenging, but it doesn't present anything other than a kind of an interruption to the daily work. We lost power on early Thursday night. Today is Sunday. We doubt that we'll get power back until late tomorrow.
So overall, being a winemaker is just such a great lifestyle.
I first walked the property in early fall of 70. And then we were able to close on the property in May of 71. It had been a vineyard in the 1880s. In June of 71, I got a logging permit from California Department of Forestry to reclaim the vineyard because there were Douglas fir trees about 24, 30 inches. A couple were, several, many maybe, were 30 inches, but nothing bigger than 30 inches. But at the base of those Douglas fir trees were little redwood split grape stakes pooched out at about a 35, 40 degree angle because that was the vineyard. And as the vineyard was consumed by phylloxera toward the end of the 19th century, the vines died and the birds did their thing about spreading seeds out, and the dying vines provided shade for the Douglas fir to grow, and up they grew and out they went at an angle.
So I want to make a point in the background for our listeners as well as our viewers. We have our friend Tucker who's running around. Tucker's just a sweet puppy of a dog, and he's just kind of not happy that he's not part of this conversation. But you'll hear the noise. We're not in a haunted house. It's okay. At least not to the best of my knowledge.
We purchased it thinking it was 200 acres. and all I can say to anybody who has a certain amount of property, wherever it is, don't get it surveyed. Rely on the 100-year-old surveyor marks as to what it is, because when you get a modern surveying, you lose a lot of property because it's not really 200 acres.
That would hurt.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, it's mostly watershed, so it really doesn't have a great deal of value. We can't plant it, but it's still, I guess it's an emotional issue. But there had been a piece of property that had been put together. George Cook was the original founder of our property. He homesteaded it in 1880. He got the local St. Helena sheriff to write a letter or to go with him down to San Francisco to the United States Land Office and got title to the property because he had cleared some of the forest and planted a certain amount of acres of vineyards and planted a row of olive trees. And that was enough to get him title. And we have the document. It's called a patent. It was signed by, on December 5th, 1884, by a president that almost nobody has ever heard of, which is Chester A. Arthur. This George Cook owned it. There is, and it was originally 500 plus acres. We broke off the 200. The other 350 acres got broken up into 20 and 40 acre parcels. And as you drive into our property, you go through and right past a cave that's dug into the north side of the road. And they had a operating winery on that property. And above that cave, there was a wooden winery that was built. They had a Roman press, classic Roman press where the log went out and it was on a mortared focal points and they pinned the tree. And then they had the wood basket out there, and I guess the number of people that could skinny out to the end of the tree made the press that much, tighter, and they got more juice out. And then they would gravity flow. There were 2 bores drilled through the soil down into the cave so that they could gravity flow with hoses into the cave where they aged the wine. I have yet to find a name. What is our property now was in the 1888 viticultural report. And Cook sold to a guy named Modine. And Modine did most of the construction up there, although Cook is the one that started the whole thing. Cook's Flat Reserve, because there's about 8 acres on the property, while it's not completely flat, a la the Napa Valley flat, it is flat for the hills. And we didn't name it Cook's Flat. We knew it was called that when we purchased it, and the locals have always referred to it as Cook's Flat. It wasn't, and I feel really fortunate to have come into the valley when I did, because I got to meet a lot of people who were, for lack of another word, aging out. And Herman Hummel was one such person. He owned what is now York Creek Vineyards, and I believe he also owned most of what is now Spring Mountain Vineyards. And Herman said that when he was farming all of this, he would take a pack train into St. Helena to buy supplies. And then they would take the pack train of like 20, 30 mules up the hill again. And then they would go into town every so many months or once a quarter or whatever. But I got to know him for a little bit and spend a little time with him. And so that was really interesting. And then Charlie and I, what is now Pride Mountain Vineyards, Charlie and I farmed in the early 70s for Dr. John Gamble and his wife Babs. And this was the old Summit Winery. And the legend is that it was owned at one time by Lily Coit, and that with Prohibition, all the wine got moved out the day or two after Prohibition, and somehow miraculously, the wine barrels all burned.
Funny how that happens.
Funny. And so anyway, we were able to see in that barn and it was owned by, what was his name? Anyway, I can't remember at the moment.
It'll come back.
Senior moment. It'll come back. Anyway, in his barn was all of the harnessing for horses, for plow horses.
Yeah, sure.
And that's how they took care of the vineyards up on the mountain. And then I was able to get to know and be friendly with Joe Heitz, which was fun. And he was a very irascible guy, but deep down, very nice. And one of the moments I remember quite fondly is that in '79, we had won the Go-Mio International Judging. They called it the Wine Olympics. And we won the German wine division. And I was at a Napa Valley Vintners meeting, and Joe Heitz comes up to me and puts his arm around me and says, "Good going, kid." and so the little moments like that. And I got to know Andrei Chelichev, worked with him. There's just, I knew both Louis P. and Louis M. Martini and Chuck Carpy and Laurie Wood from Freemark Abbey, and Denny Webb was a professor at UC Davis when I was there doing my master's work, and his brother Brad Webb was the winemaker for Freemark Abbey when they opened up in 1968. And so it was nice to know all of those people, and so I feel as though I've been able to go back and touch some people who go back to the beginning, really, of the Napa Valley wine experience and wine growth. And it wasn't until somewhere in the 80s, I think the mid-80s, that the wine industry became the most valuable agricultural crop over livestock. When I came here, it was very provincial,
Sure.
very remote. There were still walnut groves in a lot of places. There were still pear orchards. Just south of town, the St. Helena prune dehydrator had just kind of ceased operation because there had been so many prunes in the valley. At the time, Napa County had more grapes than Sonoma County, but that over the last 20, 30 years has flipped. Sure. Napa County is only half the size of Sonoma County, and they finally got onto the wine grape bandwagon, and now they have, as they should, with their acreage over there, they have about double the acreage that Napa County does. It was, and what people don't realize is that a prohibition ended on December 5th, 1933, and the wineries that had been here all went into disrepair. All their cooperage was shot. All their wine hoses were gone. All their institutional knowledge of winemaking was gone. There were only a couple wineries that survived Prohibition, and one of them was Beaulieu, and they made wine, I think, 2 or 3 others. Whether Martini was one of them, I just don't remember. But Beaulieu certainly did, and they made sacramental wine for the church. And I suspect the church bought a whole lot more wine than they, during Prohibition than they had.
Just a little bit.
And at Spring Mountain Vineyards, whatever it was called back then, they had a still. And they got tipped off by the sheriff that there was going to be a raid, so make sure you get rid of it. And what they did, apparently, is put the still down a hand-dug well and put it in the water. And then, the revenuers would show it, because the sheriff and the revenuers weren't always on the same side. And so that was kind of an interesting little tidbit. And I've forgotten now his name. When I was teaching, I taught his son. He was the winemaker at Inglenook. And when the Daniels family, John Daniels family, sold Inglenook, the winemaker there. Anyway, he went out and burned all the wine records. He was so pissed.
Yeah.
And at that time, Inglenook and Beaulieu were the two, and Krug to a certain extent, Beringer less or so, were the major
Sure.
kind of quality wineries. And at that time, Napa Valley was known for its red wines, and if you wanted a white wine, you might go to Livermore Valley and get a Wente Brothers. There weren't very many people in Napa Valley at that time. There were no pizza places. There were really no fine dining. I'm not sure there was fine dining hardly in the country, let alone here. It was genuinely rural. Smith-Madrone.com.
And always a pleasure to have you on. Stu Smith of Smith-Madrone on Springman.
I'm glad it's not just me.